The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as Margaret moved quietly through the crowded dining room, her black uniform pressed to perfection. She had worked in the Westbrook mansion for 15 years now, long enough to know exactly how Mr. Richard Westbrook liked his wine poured and how Mrs. Victoria preferred her table settings arranged. Tonight was special. The Westbrooks were hosting their annual business dinner, and the house was filled with the kind of people who wore watches worth more than cars. Margaret was 45 years old, and her hands had scrubbed these marble floors more times than she could count. She knew every corner of this massive house, every family secret whispered in hallways, every business deal discussed over breakfast. But to the Westbrooks she was invisible, just part of the furniture, something that existed to serve and then disappear. The dining room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Women in designer gowns sipped champagne, while men in expensive suits talked about stock markets and golf handicaps. Margaret weaved between them carefully, refilling glasses and removing empty plates. She had learned long ago to make herself small in rooms like this, to move like a shadow. Richard Westbrook sat at the head of the table, his face red from wine and self-importance. He was telling a story about closing some big deal, his voice booming across the room. His wife Victoria sat beside him, her diamond necklace catching the light every time she moved. Their 2 adult children were there too. Blake, their son, was 28 and had never worked a real day in his life. He had some made-up position at his father's company with a corner office he barely visited. Cassandra, their daughter, was 26 and spent most of her time shopping and posting photos online. Margaret approached the table with a fresh bottle of champagne. She had done this 1,000 times before. Poor smile politely if anyone bothered to look at her and move on. But as she reached between 2 guests to refill a glass, Blake stuck his foot out. It happened so fast. One moment Margaret was pouring, the next she was stumbling forward. The champagne bottle slipped from her hands, and red wine splashed across the white tablecloth and onto a woman's cream-colored dress. The woman shrieked, jumping up from her seat. The entire room went silent. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She looked down at the mess, then at Blake, who was barely holding back a smirk. He had tripped her on purpose. She knew it, he knew it. But before she could say anything, Richard's voice exploded across the room. "What have you done?" he roared, standing up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "Do you have any idea how much that dress costs? Are you completely incompetent?" Margaret opened her mouth to explain, but Richard wasn't interested in explanations. He was performing now, putting on a show for his guests. His face grew redder as he continued. 15 years you've worked here and you still can't perform a simple task without making a mess. This is absolutely unacceptable. I don't know why we keep you around." Victoria chimed in, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Richard dear, calm down. Though honestly, Margaret, you really should be more careful. We've been so good to you, giving you a job, a steady income. The least you could do is show some gratitude by doing your work properly." The woman with the ruined dress was making a big scene, dabbing at the stain with her napkin. Other guests whispered to each other, some looking uncomfortable, others seeming to enjoy the drama. Margaret stood there, her face warm with embarrassment, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Blake leaned back in his chair, that smirk still on his face. "Dad, maybe she's just getting too old for this kind of work. My friend's family just got a new maid, someone younger, more capable." Cassandra had her phone out now, holding it up like she was just casually checking something, but Margaret saw the red recording light. She was filming this, recording Margaret's humiliation like it was entertainment. Richard wasn't finished. He walked around the table toward Margaret, his voice filled with contempt. "You know what your problem is? You don't appreciate what you have. There are 100 people who would love to have your position, who would actually be grateful for the opportunity to work in a home like this. Maybe it's time we found one of them." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. This man who she had served breakfast to every morning for 15 years. This man whose business papers she had carefully organized when he left them, scattered around his office. This man who had no idea who she really was, what she had sacrificed or what she was capable of. "I understand, Mr. Westbrook," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, calm. It unnerved him, she could tell. He expected tears or desperate apologies. She turned to the woman with the stained dress. "I sincerely apologize, ma'am. I'll arrange for the dress to be professionally cleaned." Then she walked toward the kitchen, her head held high while the whispers followed her out of the room. Behind her, she heard Richard returning to his seat, already moving on to his next story. She heard Cassandra giggling at something on her phone. The dinner party continued as if nothing had happened. In the kitchen, Margaret stood by the sink, her hands gripping the cold edge of the counter. The catering staff looked at her with sympathy, but no one said anything. They had all heard everything. That was the thing about being invisible to people like the Westbrooks. They never realized that invisible people could see and hear everything. Margaret took off her apron slowly, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. She walked to Mrs. Victoria's office where the household schedule was kept. On a piece of the expensive letterhead that Victoria loved so much, Margaret wrote her resignation. 2 weeks' notice, professional and courteous, exactly as it should be. She left the note on Victoria's desk and gathered her coat. As she walked toward the service entrance, she passed by the dining room one last time. Through the doorway, she could see them all laughing, drinking, celebrating themselves. They had no idea what was coming. No idea that the woman they had just humiliated had been watching and learning from them for 15 years. No idea that she knew more about Richard's failing business than he did himself. No idea that every document she had filed, every conversation she had overheard, every mistake she had witnessed had been stored away in her sharp, educated mind. Margaret stepped out into the cool night air and walked to her modest car parked in the back. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking back at the mansion with all its lights blazing. Once upon a time she had been somebody. Once upon a time she had letters after her name and respect in boardrooms. Life had knocked her down, forced her to survive any way she could. But surviving and surrendering were two different things. She started the engine and drove away from the Westbrook mansion for the second to last time. In 2 weeks she would return to collect her final paycheck. After that she would never walk through their service entrance again. But she would walk through their front door. That part they would never see coming. Margaret sat in her small apartment that night, still wearing her uniform. The place was modest, just 2 bedrooms in an older building across town, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture, every bill paid on time, every meal on the table had come from her own hard work. She looked around at the life she had built from almost nothing, and for the first time in years she let herself remember who she used to be. 20 years ago, Margaret Thompson had been Dr. Margaret Thompson. She had graduated top of her class from Harvard Business School. By 30, she owned a consulting firm that helped struggling companies turn their finances around. She wore power suits and flew first class to meetings. People listened when she spoke. Her business cards were printed on expensive paper, and her name meant something in corporate circles. Then life happened the way it sometimes does, fast and cruel. Her husband got sick, cancer, the kind that moves quick and costs everything to fight. They spent their savings first, then borrowed against the house, then sold the house. Margaret closed her business to take care of him, to spend every possible moment by his side. In the end, it wasn't enough. He died anyway, and she was left with a mountain of medical debt and a 6-year-old daughter who had just lost her father. Margaret had tried to rebuild her career, but the gap in her work history was a problem. Companies wanted to know where she had been, why she had disappeared from the business world. Some were sympathetic but still didn't hire her. Others weren't even sympathetic. Meanwhile, the bills kept coming and her daughter needed stability. Needed a parent who was actually present, not working 80 hours a week trying to claw back up the corporate ladder. So Margaret made a choice. She took a job as a maid for the Westbrook family. The pay was steady, the hours were predictable, and she could be there when her daughter came home from school. She told herself it was temporary, just until she got back on her feet. But temporary turned into a year, then 5 years, then 15. Her daughter grew up. The debt got paid off slowly, and Margaret became invisible. But invisible didn't mean gone. During those 15 years, Margaret never stopped being who she really was. While the Westbrooks slept in on weekends, she took online courses in her spare bedroom. While they vacationed in Europe, she read every business book she could get from the library. And while she cleaned Richard's office, she paid attention. She noticed how he made decisions based on ego instead of data. She saw the contracts he signed without reading them carefully. She heard the conference calls where he talked over people who actually knew what they were doing. She watched Westbrook Industries slowly decline year after year, because Richard was too proud to admit he didn't know everything. Margaret had even tried to help once. 2 years ago, she had written up a detailed analysis of everything wrong with the company and how to fix it. She submitted it anonymously to the board of directors, hoping someone would listen. She had spent months on that proposal, working late into the night using every skill she had learned at Harvard and in her own business. It was good work. Maybe the best work she had ever done. Richard had dismissed it in a board meeting without even reading it properly. Margaret knew because she had been serving coffee during that meeting. He had called it impractical, the work of someone who didn't understand how real business worked. The board had backed down, not wanting to challenge him. That was when Margaret knew Richard would eventually destroy the company. It was just a matter of time. Now, sitting in her apartment, Margaret pulled out her laptop. She hadn't touched it in a few days, but her other life was there. The one the Westbrooks knew nothing about. Over the past 10 years, she had been rebuilding herself piece by piece. She consulted for small companies under a different name, helping them fix their financial problems. She didn't charge much, didn't advertise, just worked quietly and let her results speak for themselves. Word of mouth had brought her more clients than she could handle. She had been investing too, putting away every extra dollar she could. Nothing fancy, just careful, smart investments based on the same kind of analysis she used to do for Fortune 500 companies. Her portfolio had grown steadily. She wasn't rich, not like the Westbrooks, but she wasn't desperate anymore either. She had options now. Her daughter, Jessica, came home late that evening from her job at a community center. She was 26 now, working as a social worker helping families in crisis. She had turned out good despite everything. Maybe because of everything. Jessica found her mother still at the laptop, and the look on Margaret's face told her something was wrong. Margaret told her what had happened at the dinner party. She showed her the video that Cassandra had posted online. It was already spreading, people sharing it, commenting on it. Some comments defended Margaret. Others made jokes. But the video was out there now, permanent for the whole world to see. Jessica was furious. She wanted to call the Westbrooks to tell them exactly what she thought of them, but Margaret stopped her. There was something else happening, something that neither of them had expected. The video was getting attention, but not the kind Cassandra had wanted. People were figuring out who Richard Westbrook was. They were finding his company, looking into his business practices. Comments started appearing from former employees talking about how poorly they had been treated. Others shared stories about Richard's arrogance and the company's declining reputation in the business community. By the next morning, the video had been picked up by local news sites. Business ethics blogs were writing articles about it. The headline on one read, "Wealthy CEO humiliates employee at dinner party." Another said, "Is this how corporate leaders treat their staff?" The Westbrooks still hadn't taken the video down. They probably thought it was funny, that it didn't matter what people like Margaret thought, but it did matter. Over the next few days, Margaret watched as the situation snowballed. Westbrook Industries' social media pages were flooded with angry comments. Customers were threatening boycotts. Most importantly, the board of directors was paying attention. Margaret knew how boards worked. They cared about stock prices and public image. Right now, Richard Westbrook was damaging both. She got a call on the 5th day after leaving the mansion. The number was unfamiliar, but something told her to answer it. The voice on the other end was professional, careful. The woman introduced herself as Patricia Chen, a board member at Westbrook Industries. She wanted to meet with Margaret. Just to talk, she said. Margaret agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown the next morning. She didn't tell Jessica about it, didn't want to get her hopes up or worry her. This could be nothing. Maybe they wanted to offer her money to make the video go away, to sign some kind of agreement saying she wouldn't talk to the press. But when Margaret walked into that coffee shop and saw Patricia Chen waiting at a corner table, something in the woman's expression told her this was about something bigger. Patricia was in her 50s, wearing a gray suit, and she stood up to shake Margaret's hand like they were equals. They sat down, and Patricia didn't waste time with small talk. She told Margaret that the board had been concerned about Richard's leadership for a while. The viral video had forced them to act. They had spent the last few days doing research trying to understand who Margaret really was. What they found had surprised them. They found her old business, her credentials, her consulting work under her pseudonym. They found the proposal she had submitted 2 years ago, the one Richard had dismissed. Patricia had actually read it this time, really read it. She said it was brilliant. She said it was exactly what the company needed. Then Patricia said something that made Margaret's heart stop. The board wanted to remove Richard as CEO. They wanted someone who could save the company, restore its reputation, and actually knew what they were doing. They had been searching for the right person, and now they believed they had found her. They wanted Margaret to become the CEO of Westbrook Industries. Margaret sat there in stunned silence, her coffee growing cold in front of her. Patricia was serious. This wasn't a joke or some kind of test. They were offering her the job, the real job, with real power to change everything. But she only had 48 hours to decide. Margaret walked out of that coffee shop in a daze. The morning sun felt too bright, the street noise too loud. Everything around her seemed unreal. CEO of Westbrook Industries. The words kept repeating in her mind like a song stuck on loop. Patricia had given her a business card with a private number and told her to call within 2 days with her answer. She drove home on autopilot, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. This was impossible. This was insane. This was everything she had given up hoping for years ago. And yet here it was, offered to her on a silver platter by the very company whose owner had humiliated her less than a week ago. Jessica was at the kitchen table when Margaret got home, eating cereal before her shift at the community center. One look at her mother's face and she put down her spoon. "Mom, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Margaret sat down across from her and told her everything. About Patricia, about the board's decision, about the offer. Jessica's eyes grew wider with each sentence until finally she just started laughing. Not mean laughter, but the kind that comes from pure disbelief and joy mixed together. "Are you serious right now? They want you to be the CEO? The woman they just humiliated on camera? This is like something out of a movie." "I know," Margaret said quietly. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and realize it was all a dream." Jessica reached across the table and grabbed her mother's hands. "Mom, this is incredible. This is justice. This is karma doing exactly what it's supposed to do. You have to say yes," but Margaret wasn't so sure. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The practical part of her brain was already making lists. She would need new clothes, a whole professional wardrobe. She would need to prepare herself for the inevitable backlash. Richard wouldn't go quietly. The media attention would be intense. Her whole life would change overnight. But there was something deeper bothering her, something she was almost ashamed to admit even to herself. She was scared, not of Richard or the job or the responsibility. She was scared of hoping again. For 15 years she had made herself small, kept her head down, survived by not wanting too much. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break you when it didn't work out. She thought about her husband, about those last months when they had hoped so desperately that the treatments would work, that they would get more time. Hope had failed her then, had left her with nothing but debt and grief. She had learned to live without it, to focus on what was right in front of her, one day at a time. But Jessica's words kept coming back to her. This is justice. Maybe it was time to let herself hope again. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. The next morning, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She went shopping for professional clothes. Not from a thrift store or a discount rack, but from actual business stores. She tried on suits and blouses, stood in front of mirrors, and saw herself transformed. The woman looking back at her wasn't a maid. She was Dr. Margaret Thompson, and she had been hiding in plain sight for too long. She bought 3 suits, simple but well made, the kind that said she meant business. She bought new shoes that didn't have worn-down heels. She bought a leather briefcase to replace the old cloth bag she carried her things in. When the total came up at the register, she hesitated for just a moment before handing over her credit card. This was an investment in her future. She could afford it now. That evening, Margaret sat at her laptop and opened the proposal she had written 2 years ago, the one Richard had dismissed. She read through it again with fresh eyes. It was good. Really good. She had identified every major problem in Westbrook Industries and laid out clear, actionable solutions. With some updates to reflect the current situation, this could be her roadmap for the company's turnaround. She spent hours that night revising the document, adding new data, refining her strategies. This was what she was good at, what she had trained for, what she had never really stopped doing even while scrubbing floors and serving dinner. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt fully alive. At midnight, Jessica knocked on her door. "Mom, you should sleep. You've been working for hours." Margaret looked up from her screen, her eyes tired but bright. "I'm going to do it, baby. I'm going to say yes, Jessica smiled. I know. I could tell the moment you walked in yesterday. You just needed time to admit it to yourself. The next morning, Margaret called Patricia Chen. Her voice was steady when she spoke. I accept your offer. I'll be the CEO of Westbrook Industries. Patricia sounded relieved. I was hoping you'd say that. We need to move quickly. The board is meeting tomorrow to finalize Richard's removal. Can you come to the corporate offices the day after? We'll make the official announcement then. After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly for a moment. There was no turning back now. In 2 days, her entire life would change. But first, she had something she needed to do. She drove to the Westbrook mansion one last time. The security guard at the gate recognized her and waved her through without question. Why wouldn't he? As far as he knew, she was still just the maid. She parked in her usual spot by the service entrance and walked into the house she had cleaned for 15 years. Victoria was in the sitting room, reading a magazine. She looked up when Margaret entered, surprise crossing her face. Margaret? What are you doing here? I thought you quit. I came to collect my final paycheck, Margaret said calmly, and to return my key. Victoria got up and went to the desk, pulling out an envelope. Well, here it is. I must say we already found a replacement. Someone younger and more attentive to detail. Margaret took the envelope without comment. She placed her key on the desk next to a family photo. Richard, Victoria, Blake, and Cassandra, all smiling in their expensive clothes, sitting in their expensive house, completely unaware that their world was about to flip upside down. I want to thank you, Margaret said, and Victoria looked confused. Thank us? Yes, for showing me exactly who you are. For reminding me that dignity isn't something someone can take away from you. You can only give it away, and I'm done doing that. Victoria's confusion turned to irritation. I have no idea what you're talking about. If that's all, I have things to do. Margaret walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Mrs. Westbrook, I want you to remember something. I've spent 15 years in this house. I've seen everything, heard everything, learned everything. You treated me like I was invisible, like I didn't matter. That was your mistake. Are you threatening us? Victoria's voice rose. Because if you think you can... I'm not threatening anyone, Margaret interrupted calmly. I'm just saying goodbye. You'll understand soon enough. She walked out of the Westbrook mansion for the last time, leaving Victoria standing there with a puzzled, slightly worried expression. Margaret got in her car and didn't look back as she drove away. That chapter of her life was over. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. Tomorrow the board would meet. Tomorrow Richard would be fired. And the day after, the whole world would know that the maid had become the CEO. She thought about how Richard would react, how the whole family would feel when they found out. Part of her felt guilty for taking satisfaction in it. But mostly, she felt ready. Jessica came into her room around 2 a.m. and found her mother sitting by the window. Can't sleep either? Too much going through my mind, Margaret admitted. Jessica sat down beside her. Are you nervous about seeing them? The Westbrooks? A little, Margaret said honestly. But mostly I'm nervous about doing a good job. This company has real employees, people with families who depend on their paychecks. They didn't do anything wrong. They don't deserve to lose their jobs because Richard mismanaged everything. I need to do right by them. Jessica squeezed her mother's hand. That's exactly why you're the right person for this job. You care about people, not just profits. The next day felt endless. Margaret tried to keep busy, reviewing her notes, preparing herself mentally. Patricia called in the afternoon. It's done. Richard is out. The board voted unanimously. We're announcing you as the new CEO tomorrow morning at 10. Can you be here at 8 for a briefing? I'll be there, Margaret promised. That evening, Margaret laid out her new suit for the next day. She polished her shoes until they shined. She printed out her revised proposal and put it in her new briefcase. Everything was ready. She was ready. Before bed, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror and looked at herself for a long time. The woman looking back wasn't the scared widow who had taken a maid job to survive. She wasn't the invisible servant who had scrubbed floors for 15 years. She was Dr. Margaret Thompson, and tomorrow, she was going to walk through the front door of Westbrook Industries as its CEO. Tomorrow, everything would change. Margaret arrived at Westbrook Industries at 7:30 in the morning, half an hour early. The building was a sleek glass tower downtown, the kind of place she used to visit back when she was running her own consulting firm. She had driven past it hundreds of times over the years. never imagining she would one day walk through its front doors as the person in charge. She sat in her car for a few minutes, gathering her courage. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she gripped the steering wheel to steady them. This was real. This was actually happening. She thought about all those mornings she had entered the Westbrook mansion through the back door, the service entrance, making herself invisible. Today she would walk through the front entrance of their company with her head held high. Patricia met her in the lobby, along with 2 other board members. They took her up to the executive floor, showed her to Richard's old office. It was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The desk was still covered with Richard's things, his nameplate still sitting there like he would be back any minute. "We'll have all his personal items removed today," Patricia said. "You can redecorate however you like." They spent the next hour briefing Margaret on the transition. Richard had been informed yesterday evening that his contract was terminated, effective immediately. He had not taken it well. There had been shouting, threats of lawsuits, demands to speak to each board member personally. Security had eventually escorted him from the building. "He doesn't know about you yet," Patricia explained. "We kept that detail private. He'll find out at the same time as everyone else." At the announcement. At 9:30, employees started arriving for the mandatory company-wide meeting. Margaret watched from the office window as people filed into the large conference hall on the ground floor. She could see the confusion on their faces. Mandatory meetings usually meant layoffs or bad news. They had no idea what was really about to happen. At 9:45, a commotion started in the lobby. Margaret heard raised voices and Patricia's phone buzzed. She looked at it and sighed. The Westbrook family just arrived. All of them. Margaret's heart rate picked up, but she kept her expression calm. I expected they would. She could hear Richard's voice booming from down the hall before she saw him. He was demanding to be let into his office, insisting this was all a mistake, threatening to have people fired. Victoria was with him along with Blake and Cassandra. Security was trying to keep them contained in the lobby, but Richard was making a scene. Patricia looked at Margaret. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret straightened her jacket and picked up her briefcase. "I'm ready." They took the elevator down to the conference hall. The room was packed with employees, hundreds of them, all sitting in rows of chairs or standing along the walls. A stage had been set up at the front with a podium and microphone. The moment Margaret walked in, people started whispering. Some recognized her from the viral video. Others just looked confused. Patricia went to the podium first. She tapped the microphone and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. As you may have heard, there have been significant changes in leadership. The board of directors has made the decision to remove Richard Westbrook as CEO, effective immediately." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the crowd. Patricia held up her hand for silence. This decision was made after careful consideration and in the best interest of the company. "We believe Westbrook Industries has tremendous potential, but we need new direction to realize that potential, which is why I'm proud to introduce your new CEO, Dr. Margaret Thompson." Margaret walked to the podium. The whispers grew louder. She could see people pulling out their phones, probably pulling up the video, making the connection. She took a deep breath and looked out at all those faces. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. "I know many of you recognize me from a video that went viral last week." "Yes, that was me." "Yes, I worked as a maid in Richard Westbrook's home for 15 years. And yes, what you saw in that video really happened." The room was completely silent now. Everyone was listening. "But that video doesn't tell the whole story," Margaret continued. "It doesn't tell you that before I was a maid, I was a business consultant with a Harvard MBA. It doesn't tell you about the proposal I submitted to this company 2 years ago, outlining exactly what was wrong and how to fix it. It doesn't tell you about the 15 years I spent watching this company make poor decisions, waste opportunities, and treat people as disposable." She paused, looking around the room. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because this company deserves better. You deserve better. The employees who come to work every day, who do their jobs with pride, who worry about their families and their futures. You deserve a CEO who sees you as people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet." At that moment, the doors at the back of the conference hall burst open. Richard Westbrook stormed in with Victoria, Blake, and Cassandra right behind him. Security tried to stop them, but Richard pushed past. "This is ridiculous." Richard's face was red with rage. "You can't do this. This is my company. My father built this company. Patricia stood up. Mr. Westbrook, you were notified yesterday that your employment has been terminated. You're no longer authorized to be in this building. I own shares in this company. I have every right to be here. Richard was walking down the aisle now, pointing at Margaret. And her? You're replacing me with the maid? This is insane. Margaret remained calm at the podium, her hands steady on either side. Mr. Westbrook, you're welcome to stay and listen to what I have to say. You might learn something. Richard laughed, but it was an angry, bitter sound. Learn from you? You scrubbed my floors. You served my dinner. What could you possibly teach me about running a business? I could teach you about respect, Margaret said quietly, but her voice carried through the room. About treating people with dignity. About making decisions based on facts instead of ego. About listening to people instead of talking over them. I learned a lot watching you, Mr. Westbrook. I learned exactly what kind of leader I don't want to be. The employees in the room were riveted. Some were filming on their phones. This was going to be all over the internet within minutes, but Margaret didn't care. Victoria stepped forward, her voice shrill. This is humiliating. You're destroying our family's legacy. My husband built this company into what it is. Actually, Margaret said, pulling out a document from her briefcase, your husband has been running this company into the ground. Revenue is down 30% over the last 5 years. Employee turnover is at an all-time high. You've lost 3 major contracts because of poor management and bad reputation. The stock price has dropped 40%. These are facts, not opinions. She put the document down and looked directly at Richard. You dismissed my proposal 2 years ago without really reading it. You said it was impractical, that I didn't understand business. But everything I predicted would happen has happened. You just refused to see it. Blake stood up from where he had been sitting. You can't talk to my father like that. Who do you think you are? I'm the CEO, Margaret said simply. And speaking of which, Blake, Cassandra, we need to discuss your positions here. According to company records, you both hold executive titles but have contributed virtually nothing. That's going to change. Cassandra's mouth dropped open. You can't fire us. We own stock. I'm not firing you, Margaret said. I'm reassigning you. If you want to work here, you'll start in entry-level positions like everyone else. You'll learn the business from the ground up. You'll earn your way up based on merit, not your last name. If you don't like those terms, you're free to leave. The room erupted in applause. The employees were clapping, some even standing. They had been working under Blake and Cassandra's incompetence for years, watching them get paid more for doing less. Finally, someone was holding them accountable. Richard was shaking with rage. This isn't over. I'll sue. I'll take this to the board. The board voted unanimously to remove you. Patricia interrupted. It's done, Richard. It's time for you to leave. Security moved in then, professional but firm. Richard continued shouting as they escorted him toward the exit. Victoria followed, crying, her makeup running. Blake and Cassandra went with them, both looking shocked and humiliated. As the doors closed behind the Westbrook family, the room fell silent again. Margaret stood at the podium, her heart pounding but her face calm. Now, she said, let's talk about the future of this company. I've spent the last 2 days reviewing our financials, our contracts, our operations. We have serious problems, but they're fixable. It's going to take work. It's going to take everyone in this room committed to doing better. But I believe we can turn this around. She clicked a button and a presentation appeared on the screen behind her. Here's my 90-day plan. First, we're going to restructure our operations to eliminate waste. Second, we're going to rebuild our reputation by actually delivering quality work on time. Third, we're going to create a workplace culture based on respect and merit, where everyone has the opportunity to advance based on their contributions, not their connections. For the next 20 minutes, Margaret laid out her vision for the company. She spoke without notes, confident and clear. She took questions from employees, listening carefully to their concerns, addressing them honestly. By the time the meeting ended, the energy in the room had completely changed. People looked hopeful, energized, ready to work. As employees filed out, many stopped to introduce themselves to Margaret, to shake her hand, to tell her they were excited about the changes. One older woman who worked in accounting had tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said to Margaret. I've worked here for 20 years. And this is the first time a CEO has ever asked me what I thought. The first time anyone treated me like I mattered. Margaret squeezed her hand. You do matter. Everyone here matters. That's going to be the foundation of everything we do going forward. Later that evening, Margaret sat in her new office, looking out at the city lights. Her phone had been ringing nonstop. News outlets wanting interviews, business magazines wanting her story. Her social media mentions were through the roof. The video of the confrontation with Richard was already trending. Jessica called. "Mom, you're everywhere!" "I'm so proud of you." Margaret smiled, exhausted but satisfied. It was intense, but it felt right, you know? Like this was exactly where I was supposed to be. It was. You were amazing. Did you see what people are saying online? Some of it. I'm trying not to read too much. Well, you're a hero to a lot of people. The woman who went from maid to CEO in a week. It's inspiring. After hanging up, Margaret turned off her phone and just sat in the quiet. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel what she hadn't let herself feel in 20 years. Pride, hope, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that sometimes justice really does prevail. 6 months passed like a whirlwind. Margaret threw herself into the work of rebuilding Westbrook Industries with the same intensity she had once brought to raising her daughter alone and paying off impossible debts. She arrived at the office before dawn and often didn't leave until after dark. But this time the exhaustion felt different. This time, she was building something instead of just surviving. The first month had been the hardest. Margaret discovered that Richard's mismanagement ran even deeper than she had thought. There were contracts signed without proper legal review, vendor relationships damaged by his arrogance, and a toxic workplace culture where people were afraid to speak up with good ideas. She had to make tough decisions, restructure departments, and let go of a few people who had been loyal to Richard's old way of doing things, but refused to change. But she also made changes that mattered to the people who actually did the work. She instituted fair pay reviews and gave raises to employees who had been underpaid for years. She created mentorship programs so people could learn and grow. She started an education fund that paid for employees to take courses and develop new skills. The same opportunity she wished she had been offered when she was struggling. The company started to turn around. Slowly at first, then faster. They won back one of the contracts they had lost, then another. New clients started calling, interested in working with the company that had made headlines for promoting its former maid to CEO. Employee satisfaction scores went up. People started smiling in the hallways again. Margaret made it a point to know her employees. Not just the executives, but everyone. She ate lunch in the cafeteria instead of her office. She learned names, asked about families, listened to concerns. When she saw the cleaning staff working late one evening, she stopped to talk with them, asked about their lives, their dreams. She made sure they were paid fairly and treated with respect. She never forgot where she had come from. The media attention was intense at first. Everyone wanted to interview the woman who went from maid to CEO. Margaret did a few carefully chosen interviews, using the platform to talk about second chances, about the value of all work, about treating people with dignity regardless of their job title. She became a voice for working people everywhere who felt invisible and undervalued. But the story that really mattered was happening quietly, away from cameras. It was happening in the life of a young woman named Rachel who worked in the mailroom. She had dreams of being a graphic designer but couldn't afford to go back to school. Margaret's education program made it possible. Within 6 months, Rachel was taking night classes. Within a year, she would be working in the company's marketing department, designing materials that would help win new business. It was happening, in the accounting department, where that older woman who had thanked Margaret with tears in her eyes finally got promoted to a position she had deserved for a decade. It was happening in small ways and big ways, as people who had been overlooked suddenly found themselves seen, valued, and given real opportunities to grow. As for the Westbrook family, their fall from grace was swift and public. Richard tried to start consulting for other companies, but no one wanted to hire the CEO who had been fired for incompetence and cruelty. The video of him being escorted out of his own company's building had been watched millions of times. His reputation was destroyed. Victoria, who had never worked a day in her adult life, had to get a job. She ended up working as an event coordinator for a catering company. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She was now serving wealthy people at their parties just as Margaret had once served her family. Margaret heard she was actually decent at the job, once she got over the initial shock of having to work for a living. Blake and Cassandra had both left Westbrook Industries rather than accept entry-level positions. Blake tried to use his father's connections to get a job at another company, but those connections had dried up. He eventually took a job as a junior sales associate at a car dealership. Cassandra became a social media influencer, but her following was small and the income was unpredictable. Both of them had to move out of their expensive apartments into places they could actually afford. Margaret took no pleasure in their struggles. She had never wanted revenge, just justice and the chance to do things right. But she couldn't deny that there was something fitting about how things had turned out. One afternoon, about 5 months into her tenure as CEO, Margaret got an unexpected visitor. Her assistant buzzed her office. "There's a Victoria Westbrook here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." Margaret was surprised, but she agreed to the meeting. Victoria walked in looking different than Margaret remembered. She was dressed simply, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail instead of the elaborate style she used to wear. She looked tired. She looked human. "Thank you for seeing me," Victoria said quietly, sitting down across from Margaret's desk. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Westbrook?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, looking down at her hands. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "I came to apologize for everything, for how we treated you, for that dinner party, for all the years before that when we made you feel like you were less than human." Margaret waited, letting Victoria continue. "I've spent the last few months working for the first time in my life, having a boss, following orders, serving people who sometimes treat me like I'm beneath them. And every single day, I think about you. About how you must have felt day after day, year after year. We were horrible to you, I was horrible to you." Victoria wiped her eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I needed you to know that I understand now. I understand what we took from you. Not just dignity, but years of your life where you had to make yourself small just to survive. And I'm so sorry." Margaret sat back in her chair, studying the woman across from her. This wasn't the Victoria she remembered. This was someone who had been humbled by life, who had learned something real about struggle and compassion. "Thank you for saying that," Margaret said finally. "It means more than you probably realize. I also want you to know," Victoria continued, "that what you've done with the company is remarkable. The changes you've made, the people you've helped. My husband never saw the employees as real people. He saw them as tools to make money. But you see them. You care about them. That's why you're succeeding where he failed." They talked for nearly an hour. It wasn't quite forgiveness, not yet. Some wounds take time to heal, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was two women who had lived very different lives, finding a moment of honest connection. As Victoria was leaving, she paused at the door. "Margaret, I hope someday you can forgive us, but even if you can't, I want you to know that watching you rise from where we tried to push you down has taught me more about strength and grace than anything else in my life." After Victoria left, Margaret sat quietly in her office for a long time. She thought about forgiveness, about justice, about the strange paths life takes us on. She didn't know if she could fully forgive the Westbrooks yet, but she was open to the possibility. That felt like growth. The 6-month mark brought a celebration. The board held a reception to recognize the company's turnaround. Stock prices were up, profits were up. But more importantly, people were happy. The company culture had transformed into something healthy and sustainable. At the reception, Patricia Chen gave a speech praising Margaret's leadership. 6 months ago, this company was failing. Today, we're thriving. And it's all because one woman had the courage to step into her power and show us what real leadership looks like. Margaret gave a speech too, but she didn't talk about herself. She talked about the employees who had embraced change, who had worked hard, who had believed in the company's new direction. She recognized people by name, celebrated their contributions, made them feel seen. Later that evening, Jessica joined her mother at the office. They stood together at the window looking out at the city lights. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Jessica said. "Look at everything you've accomplished." Margaret smiled, putting her arm around her daughter. You know what I'm most proud of? It's not the corner office or the title or even turning the company around. It's that I get to show people that your circumstances don't define you, that you can fall down and get back up. That kindness and competence aren't weaknesses, they're strengths. You've inspired so many people, Jessica said. I see it every day at the community center. People tell me about your story, about how it gives them hope. As they stood there together, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The loss and grief, the years of struggle, the humiliation at that dinner party, that had seemed like rock bottom, but had actually been the beginning of something new. She had learned that sometimes you have to be broken down before you can be built back stronger. The next morning, Margaret arrived at work early as usual. As she walked through the lobby, she noticed a young woman from the janitorial staff cleaning the windows. Margaret stopped and introduced herself, asked the woman's name, learned that she was studying to be a nurse. Keep studying, Margaret told her. And if you ever need help with tuition, talk to HR about our education program. That's what it's there for. The woman's face lit up with gratitude and surprise. After she walked away, Margaret continued to her office with a smile. This was what it was all about. Not the power, or the paycheck, or the revenge. It was about using whatever position you had to lift other people up, to see them, to help them reach for their dreams. She sat down at her desk and looked at the framed photo she had placed there. It was of her and Jessica, taken the day Margaret had accepted the CEO position. Both of them were smiling, hopeful, ready for whatever came next. Margaret opened her laptop and began reviewing the day's agenda. There was work to do, a company to run, people counting on her leadership. And she was ready. She had always been ready. The world just needed to catch up and see what she had known all along, that everyone deserves dignity, everyone deserves respect, and everyone deserves the chance to show the world what they're truly capable of when someone finally believes in them.